It's Friday, the 23rd of August, and welcome to the Edinburgh Fringe. Yes, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Welcome to Edinburgh. The weekend approaches. The last big nights of the Fringe are here. Every night is important, but Friday and Saturday can make or break your run. That gives them a lot of oomph. Every show. If you can fill every show, if you can get one massive house, there's so much that can impact your run. And of course, it's not necessarily financial success. You might want critical success. You might want certain people to see you. You might want to find a new manager or a new artistic director. There's a lot of ways you can win at the Fringe. Because the Fringe is not just one thing, it is many things. There are lots of points, there are lots of things to discuss, and there will always be differences of opinion. So later on in the show, I'm going to be speaking to Anthony Alderson from the Plesance, and we're going to talk a lot about the Fringe itself. But before that, one of those chances for winning at the Fringe comes from the Scotsman. Every week they have their Fringe First Awards, and we have the last 5 shows which have picked up one of the awards that's been running for over 50 years for the best new theatre work debuting at the Fringe. And of course they've been announcing these throughout August, so you have a chance to get some recommendations every week. So the 5 that we have going into the final stretch. First up at the Traverse is A Knock on the Roof, Kwala Ibrahim's monologue about a young Palestinian mother living in Gaza with her 4-year-old son when the Israeli assault on Gaza begun. Summer Hall has the show Instructions, and it's a show that explores the limits of consent in entertainment and beyond, and self-determination and individualism all wrapped up in there. After the Lavoya is at Summer Hall, a pair of Jewish twins getting involved in a Tarantino-esque heist based around a plot to kidnap Jeremy Corbyn. My Mother's Funeral. The show is at Roundabout Summer Hall. Abigail has lost her mother, and as a young working class theatre maker, doesn't have the £4,000 for the funeral. A lot of examination there on artistic pressure. And finally, a little inquest into what we were all doing here at Zoo Southside. Josie Dale-Jones lists what she now believes did and didn't work about her proposed sex education show for children and the discussions that happened online when the show first started to be discussed. Links to all of those will be back at the Scotsman's website, which is going to be linked from our website, edinburghfringe.thepodcastcorner.com, and that will take you to the full reviews in the Scotsman and into the ticket offices and the locations and everything you do to need to go and see those shows. And yes, it is the final week of the Fringe. It is your last chance. It's your last chance to go and see the shows that you want to see. It's the last chance to find new recommendations, whether it be one of the Fringe firsts, anybody we've had on the interviews, or one that you've picked up in reviews elsewhere. And it's also your final chance just to run up to a venue and go, what's on next? Give me a ticket, hand over some money, and get the surprise of the Fringe handed to you. But before you do that, or while you're standing in the queue, we're going to speak to Anthony Alderson of the Plesance. We're going to touch on several critical issues that come up when running one of the largest venues at the Edinburgh Fringe, including the continuing impact of COVID and the importance of government funding to the Fringe community in general and to the Plesance specifically. Given the cost of the Fringe is a discussion point that is always on everyone's minds, we also talk about turnover, tickets and artistic risk. We also look at the work of the Pleasance to support and promote the arts at Edinburgh in August and beyond, including various Pleasance Futures projects and Anthony's ambition to create a sustainable touring circuit for theatre in the United Kingdom. Joining me now, many titles, many chairs, but He's the bloke at the top of the Plesance that takes responsibility for everything. Welcome to the show, Anthony Alderson.
Thank you, Ewan. It's delightful to be here again.
How many years?
I have been at the Plesance for 38 years, I think now, but as director for 20. So Christopher and I, it's our 40th anniversary this year, so Christopher and I have done 20 years each.
How does that make you feel?
Tired. It does. Do you know, it's such a privilege to run this organisation. I do have to pinch myself and remind myself that I probably have one of the best jobs in the arts, because you get to put on this remarkable festival every year, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes there are great shows and sometimes there aren't, but you get to reinvent it every year. So every sort of 12 months you go back to the drawing board and go, right, well, what are we going to do next year? Which direction are we going to go in next? And I think that's a real privilege.
What direction did you not go in this year then?
I don't know what direction we didn't go in. I mean, I think the job is always to try and create a programme that is balanced. You've got to try and create something for everybody. And it's reminding that programming team all the time that, you know, we've got to try and find something for, you know, a whole audience. And so it might not be to their taste, but there will be an audience for it. And then it's about trying to put the right shows in the right rooms. And that's our experience, and going back to those companies and saying to them, maybe this isn't the right room to be in, or maybe this is maybe you need to be in a smaller room or even a bigger room. So it's that constant conversation with artists about, you know, what it is they're doing. I think one of the things I've noticed this year is that because the cost of bringing shows to Edinburgh has gone up again, that things like the technical, you know, the production levels in some of those things have maybe come down a little bit because they can't afford to hire some of the equipment that they might have hired, or we don't have it, or whatever it might be. But it's meant that actually the focus is going back to writing. It's going back to performance, which I think is just as exciting. I mean, I think there is some brilliant new writing on the festival this year. And I really notice it. I notice it in those things. I mean, I don't think it's a problem, but I think it's the effect. I mean, it's the effect of, you know, if Edinburgh is an expensive city to be in, then productions are going to adapt and change in order to be able to get here.
You've brought up the cost there. Tell me about the costs about running a venue, because the artist costs for accommodation and staging is relatively well known. What's it like running a venue under the cost pressures, and what are they now?
It's a little bit like putting on a wedding. You go to any supplier and you say, well, I'm having a wedding, and they say, hang on a minute, we've got a different price list for that. And it's a little bit the same with the festival. So you go to, you know, any of those companies that hire equipment or do all of those sort of things, and there is definitely a festival. There's definitely a festival price list. I mean, we couldn't do what we do if we didn't have companies like Blacklight and Orbital and Arena Seating who actually support the thing. They can see the absolute value in it, and they make absolutely sure that it's affordable so that we can carry on doing it. But it's all the little ancillary bits. It's the cost of being here. It's the cost of housing and feeding, you know, people, and it's the cost of living. It's the same for all of us in many ways. But during festival time, it just goes up a bit more. And our job is to really balance that, the cost of that against the cost of the ticket. And I did say, I mean, last year I sort of said, actually, people remember the good old days when tickets were only £4 and so on. But actually, if you look at inflation, you know, that's the equivalent of a £12 ticket today. Well, the average ticket at the Plesance is still only just over £12. So I think the cost of the festival for people coming actually really hasn't changed compared to the cost of a cup of coffee, the cost of a meal out, the cost of all of those things have become more expensive. So in fact, the margin, you know, for us to be able to get to break even has got tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. And there is a fulcrum point at which that's going to be very difficult. And we're getting quite close to it, if we haven't passed it already.
How much impact did COVID have moving that fulcrum closer to the point?
An enormous difference. I mean, the amount of infrastructure that we now have to put in terms of air handling, in terms of all of that, it wasn't something that people particularly noticed before. I mean, it was something we always did, but it was then there was a big focus on, right, we have got to concentrate on making sure that the air handling in venues is better. We've got to do all of that. So I think that had a huge effect. I mean, the big effect for us was, of course, it wiped out any reserve that the charity had built up. So it was like going back 20 years. It was going back and saying, actually, we've now got to be, that always gave us that little bit of comfort that maybe meant we could produce or co-produce or support shows in a different way. That suddenly become more difficult. And so actually we have to count the pennies and be very careful. And I think the one thing that people forget about venues is that we only get 27 days in which to try and make that money back. One hopes that a show coming will then have a life onwards, and they will then be able to recoup any loss that they might have made in the future life of the show. Whereas a venue, you've only got that point. And because we work on a risk basis with the companies, and the deal is the same as it's always been, which is we will build the venue, you bring the show, and we will split that box office, with you. And those deals we've had to change. So, for example, in the very small venues where it's really difficult to kind of recoup your money as an artist, we're doing a different deal. We put 5% back into the pot for the artists. But that, of course, just makes it a little bit more difficult for us to pay the bills at the end. So it's a much, much finer balance of getting that right to make absolutely sure that we can come back the following year.
So coming out of COVID, there was a support fund with government support and through the Fringe Society. And a lot of the smaller venues questioned why the big four were getting such a large slice of that. How important was that fund to keeping the Plesance at the Fringe?
Oh, absolutely vital. I mean, absolutely vital.
Are we at that? If that fund hadn't been there, we would have had no Plesance?
We couldn't have done it. We couldn't have. I mean, we perhaps could have gone and borrowed more money. I mean, we had to take out a big loan like many companies did. And perhaps we would have lost, we would have lost staff. We would have lost. I mean, that first year coming back was incredibly difficult because so many freelancers weren't properly supported during COVID. Actually, a lot of them moved out of the theatre industry.
Just because at the time, for those not fully aware, self-employed were not given any of the governmental support in wages or monthly. So
that's right.
People in the arts were essentially, you're not getting any money, but somebody who used to work in a bank, we're going to keep their wages high. And
that was the same. So the furlough was without a doubt the thing that kept us going. We made absolutely sure that all that full-time team, and in fact all of our part-time staff, we kept all of them on and made absolutely sure that they were getting their wage. I mean, it was really crucial because I knew if we reduced it, we would lose them. Because, if you work in fringe theatre, the wages are not high in the first place. So it was incredibly important to keep that team together.
And this is where the fund came in.
And that's where those bits of funding came in. But it was... we are a charity both in Edinburgh and we are a charity in England too. But there is that line between the two countries. So we weren't eligible for all of the funds that were in Scotland. We certainly weren't eligible for all the funds in England. We sort of fell between the stools in many ways. But those very particular funds to support the festival were absolutely crucial. There's no way we could have survived without it.
So I mentioned the big four there, which includes Gilded Balloon, Underbelly, yourselves and Assembly.
We've never called it the Big Four. Which
comes to my point, delightfully. A lot of people look at that and say Big Four, as I have there. And do you feel that group of venues comes in for too much criticism?
I think we're all different. I think that's the first thing to say. I think we operate on completely different models. Some of the venues get to run their bars. Some of them don't. I mean, the Gilded Balloon and us, we don't run the bars. The university run the bars. I don't particularly want to run the bars because actually what I want to do is concentrate on the art and concentrate on putting on theatre. And actually, I think the reason that we've had such a fantastic relationship with the University Students' Association is because they run the bars and actually they employ hundreds of students, every year. That relationship has been really, really brilliant. I mean, I always go and ask them for a bit more of it, and And we have a little, negotiation about it. But at the end of the day, all of the money that they're earning goes back into the Students' Association. The rent from the university goes back into the university. And the money that we earn goes back into the Plesance. I mean, it's quite a thing to have 3 charities working together. And then the fourth part of that is that we've supported Waverley Care for 31 years. And it's the fourth charity in that sort of partnership. And we're incredibly proud to carry on supporting them because they're incredibly vital. And they really missed the support during COVID. It was that fact that actually during the festival our audiences are incredibly generous. They raise about £60,000 a year for Waverley Care. And of course suddenly there were 2 years when they couldn't, and I think that meant that they had to cut essential services. And so you suddenly realise how valuable that partnership is. And so we're delighted that we're back sort of helping them again. And so I think that, but I think all the venues work in different ways. I mean, we are corporately different. I think we're commercially sometimes, similar in terms of the box office splits are the same or they're different. We compete. We try and share the marketing because obviously, actually doing some of that together means that you're getting more for your money. So it makes it more affordable for the artist coming. So it makes sense to do some of it together, which is why the festival works, actually having the Fringe Society in the middle and sharing some of that risk, means that if we were a standalone venue on our own trying to do all of that together, it would be far, far harder. But I think we do come into a lot of, I think we have come into a lot of criticism because I think some people look at it and go, these venues must be making a lot of money. And the artists are always seen to be leaving without any money. And it does come back to that 27 days. We've only got 27 days to make it work. And there isn't a lot at the end. I mean, our turnover in tickets in 2022 was just over £6 million. Get to the very end of the financial year and the surplus that came back to the charity was just over 10 grand. Well, that's an incredibly tight margin, and you're being incredibly careful about how to, manage that. It's a very, very precarious thing, but it always has been. I mean, the putting on theatre has always been precarious. I don't think that's going to change. We've got to try and find ways of supporting artists more.
One of the ways you support, of course, is Young Pleasance. Is it Young Pleasance? I can't remember the title of it now. That brings in young artists and helps with that risk. We run an umbrella called Pleasance Futures. That's the one.
And we run basically a number of different programs within it. So the Kids Zone is right at the beginning, which is about trying to introduce children to the theatre and introduce children to the festival. Through the generosity of one of our patrons, we now pay for the buses and for around about 1,500 tickets for primary school children in the first week of term now in Edinburgh to come into the festival. Many of them coming, from, areas of Edinburgh that maybe felt that it wasn't for them. So actually, I think introducing those children into the festival is incredibly important. And I think this week for me is about us trying to engage with the city in a really positive way to try and bring young people in, because in 10 years' time that will be 20,000 children, and some of those youngsters will be 18, 19-year-olds who maybe then think maybe there is a career in the arts, or maybe I've learned something in the arts that's incredibly vital. So that's the first step of it. The next step is the Young Plesance, which is our youth theatre company. It celebrates its 30th birthday next year. And that is a production company that brings... We have an open audition in February, and that brings 30, 40 young people from 16 to 21. They rehearse in London. They come to Edinburgh for 2 weeks. They put on a show. And... they come and experience the festival for the first time. The next step is called XYP, which is then some of them might go, ooh, I quite fancy this thing of producing. So we hold their hand while they try and produce their first pieces of work. Then there's an associates program, which is very much about supporting a number of artists during the year in London, and we hope that they will go on to develop work that will then come to the festival. Then there's the Charlie Hartill Fund, which is a dedicated fund named after Charlie Hartill, who was a member of the Pleasance team. He died in 2004. Christopher set it up as a fund to try and support pieces of work with 4 or more people on stage, very deliberately, to try and encourage people to do bigger productions. And they are fully funded pieces of work that come to Edinburgh, and we help them. And actually, again, they get a producer from the Plesance to help them kind of produce that work. That's expanded, and I think there are 3 pieces of theatre this year. One of them is to support global majority artists, very specifically. And then the other half of the Charlie Fund is to support 4 comedians. And over all of those years, we brought many, many comedians up to the festival. So they have that level of support. And then the final bit we put together was something called the Edinburgh National Partnership Scheme. And we started it 4 years ago because I realised that the regional producing houses were, finding these brilliant, this brilliant new talent, writing talent, acting talent, but it didn't have anywhere necessarily to go. There wasn't a route into the festival. And I think that, we now have partnerships with, I think, 6 or 7 different regional theatres where we put a little bit of money into that. They bring the show, and hopefully that energy goes back to that theatre. And what we really want to try and do is to really start to engage that small, medium-scale touring circuit again, because theatre needs to tour at this level. The Fringe Theatre, you can't, possibly make enough money for doing a show anywhere in this country for a short period of time. But if you can build a profile around that show by coming to Edinburgh, where you get that sort of, you hopefully leave with a good press pack and people have seen it. You take all that energy back to your town, and then you've got a circuit upon which you can then start to get the sort of wheels moving again. Well, hopefully that will then mean that they've got, if I could get it up to 12 theatres, and we could then, you might have a 12-week tour out of it. So it's really trying to answer different things within the industry to try and help those people. And then the last part of it is we actually run a sixth formers scheme for, again, children in Edinburgh. And what we try and do is bring them in, give them a department within the Plesance where they can shadow someone. So it might be in the box office, it might be in front of house. They come in for a couple of days, they shadow one of the technicians for a day, and they might just go, actually, this is something we want to do. So it's a sort of early apprenticeship. And then we do an awful lot of, workshops in producing. We do workshops in directing, international touring, so that we try and make sure that this whole community is a learning exercise as much as it is about coming and being part of that, energy.
What was it like waking up one morning and realising this was your calling?
Oh, blimey, I'm not sure. Do you know what? I came into the Pleasance when I was 15 years old. Sort of ran away with the circus, and I've loved it ever since. But I did have a few years in the middle where I went away and did. I worked with a wonderful woman called Glynis Henderson, who and she still brings work to the Edinburgh Festival. I worked on the show Stomp, and what was wonderful about that was that I got to take a big commercial show, to I think it was 52 different countries around the world. But what it gave me was a real understanding of how theatre works in other countries. And it works incredibly different in Scandinavia. It works incredibly different in South America and in Japan or in North America. Every model is different. And that gave me a great big network of promoters and producers and things. And then I woke up one day and thought, I miss the Fringe. And I miss this, this is the absolute cutting edge of theatre. It's where, some of the best new voices and writers and directors, performers are coming from. And I thought, that's the thing I miss. That's the thing I want to be part of.
In all of those 20 years at the head of the Plesance, working within the Plesance, working in the arts, if you could only ever see one more show once, what show would you go and see again?
Blimey, that is a question. There are 2 that stand out. Last year, we did a show called Dark Noon, and we took it on. Glynis and I we did it together. She rang me up and said, "Do you fancy producing again?" And what I loved about it was we took it to America last year, earlier this year. And it was concentrating on one show, and it was being part of a company and doing a single piece of work. It was the most extraordinary piece of work, and I'm incredibly proud that we did it. I think another one was a young man called Elliot Warren who brought, it was a piece called Flesh and Bone, and it was about a group of people living in the East End of London in a tower block, and all the difficulties of that, but it was written in rhyming couplets. And it was like, my goodness me, we have found this extraordinary voice. And all he had on stage was a chair and I think a balloon was the only other thing they had. And again, it went off and toured around the world, and he's now a very successful actor. He just appeared in the Masters of the Air series that was on Apple. I think those two stand out. I mean, goodness me, I mean, there are so many. There are so many shows that I think I see something every year that makes you sit up and think a bit differently and think, yeah, the world is going to change if only everybody could see this piece of work.
And that's why we keep doing this.
And I think that's why we keep coming back to it. And I think that's why this is so important. I asked Professor Tanya Byron, who writes a column in the Times, to write a piece in the front of our brochure about mental health. And, we are, it is in the news all the time, the mental health crisis that young people are facing, the fragility of people coming out of COVID, the impact of social media and how difficult that is, and telephones and that addiction we have to digital devices and so on. And she wrote this, really quite extraordinary piece of writing about, what is happening in our brains and why the arts is so important. And I started to do more research into, mental health and the arts and so on. And I think people are beginning to realise that actually the arts has a hugely, hugely valuable role to play within our society. Lord Bragg stood up in the House of Lords and said, it's not the cherry on the cake, it is the cake. This goes back to, who we are. It goes back to our community. It goes back to, helping people with loneliness. It goes back to, being maybe a little bit of the solution in helping, solve antisocial behaviour. We've cut so many services across counties across the entire country. But I think the arts has got a really, really valuable role to play in, building community again, about bonding all of those things together. I read this wonderful report. It was produced by the London School of Economics, and they did a survey where they asked people to rate, out of 10 or out of 100, what experiences related to happiness or related to sadness. And the arts was all at the top. It was about singing, it was about dancing, it was about being part of a community theatre group. And sport was the same. It was exactly, they were both at the top of the list. And then all of those obvious things like commuting and being unwell and so on were all at the bottom of the list. And you kind of think, there are so many professional people out there shouting, saying, look at how valuable all of this is. And we've just got to try and persuade our politicians to listen and go, look, this isn't an add-on to our lives. Culture isn't something that's a bolt-on. It's not for the privileged. And actually, if you keep cutting the arts in education, then what you're doing is actually making the arts elitist. It's actually a government policy now that seems to be pushing the arts into this sort of elitist, it's only for them sort of scenario. Well, actually, if we put it back into schools in a really fundamental way, and that means more than 1 hour a week for music and more than 1 hour a week for drama, I think we would start to see some real change in young people coming out of schools. And I think we would be able to, they might not have a career in the arts, but goodness me, they come out different people. You watch young people come into the festival for 3 weeks and they are so different when they leave at the end. Now they may go on and have a career as in law or in architecture or whatever it might be, but goodness me, they come out different people. Christopher Richardson, who started this, was a school teacher, and he came. He opened the venue the first year. I don't think he had any great plan to do it the second year, but he made 200 quid And I mean, I think it took him 15 years to make 200 quid again. But he got hooked because what he wanted to do was to support people with bright ideas and to give them practical, really, really practical thing in the middle that helped. And I think what the Pleasance has always been doing is providing that practical support, providing now a bit of financial support and a bit of the sort of, critical mass, if you like. We are just a microcosm of the entire festival. And I think if we can try and keep putting that financial support back into the bottom, then actually we will get this thing to carry on. And we've now done, in 40 years, we've done 6,000, and I think I added it up, 6,033 productions, 157,000 performances to an audience of probably tens of millions of people. Well, you think of all the ripple effects that has, and I think that has provided a profound, positive, really, really positive difference. And I think what we've got to be better at is shouting about the fact that we are here to support people. This is a charity, and we are, we want to be part of that community. We're not here to try and take something out of Edinburgh. In fact, what we're doing, I think, is putting an awful lot in. And it would be nice to be recognised for it occasionally.
Anthony, as always, thanks very much for your time in your 27 days. A pleasure as always.
Thank you very much indeed.
Anthony Alderson there from the Pleasance, www.pleasance.co.uk. Link is back at our website, but for once, that one's shorter than ours, edinburghfringe.thepodcastcorner.com, where of course you will find links to all the shows and all the news posts that we do mention throughout the month of August. We do have an epilogue coming up on Monday, but for now, go out there, enjoy the time that's left for you if you're in Edinburgh. If you're not in Edinburgh, as always, thanks for your ears. Go find the artists on social media, find the venues, find the directors, find the scriptwriters, follow them. They're creating work, mystery, marvel, stories, imagination, and it is all there for you to engage with and for you to support. As always, if you can, link, like, love, share and subscribe to the podcast. If you're in a directory, then you can leave a star rating or review. It will help people find us throughout the year. And for now, I'm going back in for my last chance in the capital city of the arts world. So I will catch you in Edinburgh, at the Fringe, or beyond. You've been listening to the Edinburgh Fringe Show, hosted by Ewan Spence, produced by Spence Media and Radio 6 International. Listen to more at edinburghfringe.thepodcastcorner.com.